Think about sports for just a second. Loaded question, I know. Most sports have a guy, maybe two, who are the go-to rapid-fire answers for the greatest player in the history of that sport that about 99.9% of fans could agree on. Boxing has Muhammad Ali, football has Tom Brady, swimming has Michael Phelps, hockey has Wayne Gretzky, basketball has Michael Jordan, possibly LeBron, soccer has Pele, possibly Messi. Baseball doesn't have the guy everyone puts on a pedestal, but there very well could have been one. It's a lot more divided by what generation you grew up in without one universally agreed upon king. About 30 years ago, my dad had a friend from Morocco. The guy had a lot of money, but not a lot of baseball knowledge. He was on a golf course one time and struck up a conversation with some dude he wound up playing with. My dad gets a phone call later that day that goes something like, "Hey man, you know about baseball. I played golf today with this guy who says he played. His name was Ted Williams, I think. Was he good?" Well, Ted Williams could have went down as the very best, but factors other than his ungodly hitting performance prevented that narrative from coming to be. The first thing we have to do are go over some baseball stats. If you hate numbers, I don't know what to tell you. Ted Williams, at 20 years old and in his first MLB season, drove in more runs than any MLB player has driven in the last 15 years. He walked at totals no one without steroids has matched since. In 4 different decades, he had years as one of the best hitters in baseball, but yet is equally known for having his decapitated head frozen in a lab as he is for his on-field baseball accomplishments. Like, possibly the greatest baseball player of all time. It's crazy, and I can totally explain it. But in order to first make an argument about someone having the path to go down as the very best, we need to dedicate some time to rattling off facts that make Ted Williams the baseball player so memorable. Williams has the highest on-base percentage in MLB history, not that far off from reaching base in half of his times batting. He was getting on base more often than Queso advocates for his viewers to get banned in chat.
Find this dude's name and ban him on every single platform.
His slugging percentage and on-base plus slugging percentages are the second highest of all time, behind only Babe Ruth. So, only the most famous baseball player who has ever lived had a better combination of reaching base via finesse and clobbering balls like no tomorrow. OPS Plus reduces that funky-looking decimal number to one whole number, where 100 is always average, also adjusting for different stadiums and time periods to give a true estimate of how good someone was at hitting compared to their competition. The only two better than him were Babe Ruth and Josh Gibson, and Williams is still nearly twice as good as the average hitter from 1939 all the way to 1960. He's 4th all-time in walks behind only Barry Bonds, Rickey Henderson, and Babe Ruth, all of whom we've already given their flowers in detail on this channel before. And his batting average is the 5th best all-time, only beaten by guys who are decades older than him. If you're one of the modern-day Zoomers who thinks batting average doesn't matter, I bring Ted Williams' up for a pretty significant reason. The most famous achievement Ted Williams ever had was in 1941, being the last MLB player to ever hit 400 in a season. 40% of his at-bats in 1941 wound up being hits. Granted, his absolutely inhuman walk rate helped make that possible. Walks don't count as at-bats. But he still was unquestionably the best hitter of his generation. Better than the guys in the generation after that, and after that, and after that, and after that. 406 is better than any individual season after it, and 344 for his career is better than any individual player after him. What separated him from every other great high batting average, high walk guy is that he was also the best power hitter in baseball too. He hit 406 while also leading MLB in home runs. That is just unfathomable today. Especially for a guy so skinny, his nickname was the Splendid Splinter. Like, my Italian great-grandmother would be so offended by the sight of him and beg this man to eat more. So in 1941, Williams led baseball in home runs and batting average, but couldn't pick up a triple crown because his team wasn't good enough to give him proper RBI chances. He would win the old school triple crown the next year and in 1947. I've seen analytically sound fans today suggest that there should also be some kind of informal triple crown for the rate stats. Batting average, on base, slugging, OPS, the stats that show as decimals or percentages basically. Williams would have totally won plenty of those, as recently as 1957. The 406 year was in 1941, and in 1957 he was still like the best hitter in baseball. We've already talked about how good he was when he was a 20-year-old rookie, driving in 145 runs and also leading the AL in total bases and intentional walks. Again, as a rookie. But how about when he was in his last big league season, in 1960 when he was 41 years old? There's a famous story that in Ted Williams' last big league at bat, he hit a home run because of course he did. Then, he did not tip his cap to salute the Red Sox fans that he had been making smile for over 20 years. Oh yeah, his entire career was played for the Boston Red Sox, by the way. Tipping your cap is typically a universal sign of players saying thank you to the fans in baseball. Williams didn't ever tip his cap to them, for the simple reason that he knew he was extremely good, and allegedly, vowed to never ever do that for Red Sox fans because they booed him early in his career, until he finally came around to doing it. 31 years after he stopped playing. My man could really hold a grudge. He thought it was just his thing to bury himself in the fact that he was leaps and bounds better than everyone else, and was above showing gratitude to the fans to the point where a writer described his behavior in not showing appreciation back to those fans who loved him as gods do not answer letters. This is basically how he treated Red Sox fans, all the time.
Now, oh my God, what the what? Oh my God, can you let me do what I need to do?
This is not going to be the last time we're going to touch on Ted being kind of a jerk. My point here is, he was totally right to think he was really good. The stats here on the left of your screen are 2023 Shohei Ohtani, the consensus best player on Earth who unanimously won an MVP award. Now this is 41-year-old Ted Williams. Oh my God. The fact that this is even remotely similar is beyond insane. He never fell off. He never lost his talents. He was good every single year from 1939 to 1960. I mean, he was a 19-time All-Star who earned all of them. Legit, his only shortcoming was he was a pretty rough fielder in left field who could never figure out how to play defense well. Who could blame him, considering he played his home games at a park with a giant monster in left field? With how long of a career without a fall-off he had, you might be surprised to see that he had only 521 career home runs, and a little over 121 wins above replacement. That's a stat that basically means that Ted gave the Red Sox 121 more wins in his career than what was considered a replacement-level left fielder at that time. And you'd be right. It is lower than he should have had. Because this man lost out on nearly 5 whole seasons of his career when he was busy serving the United States military in 2 different wars. Williams missed all of the 1943, 1944, and 1945 seasons, and significant portions of the 1952 and 53 seasons to serve in the US Navy and Marine Corps. Think about how many great years he didn't get to fulfill. We already know that he wasn't going to slow down, considering he was basically somewhere in between 2023 Shohei Ohtani and 2015 Bryce Harper as a 41-year-old hitter. Age was not going to stop him, like ever. And when he came back, he just jumped right back into being amazing. Imagine how good he could have been from 1943 to 1945 if he regularly saw big league pitching and not war stuff. We're talking about a guy who could have made a push for Babe Ruth's home run record, and he would have shattered, and I mean shattered, his walks record. I could go on for hours about how good Ted Williams was as a hitter, but that doesn't make my point for how he was robbed of GOAT status. It's finally time for that theory, and it starts with this. A man who frequently gets called the greatest hitter who ever lived has more military awards than baseball awards. These are all the military awards and honors given to Ted Williams, not counting his Hall of Fame plaque he only had 2 baseball awards. Both were MVP awards. He really should have had 5 or 6, possibly all in a row. Remember how I said Ted Williams could be kind of a jerk? Well, he really hated baseball writers. Williams had a very uneasy relationship with them for a while. A cycle of him thinking he deserved more praise for how good he was, not getting it, being standoffish with them, the writers then doing things that would piss him off, and that went on for decades. He didn't take well to writers ever criticizing him, which was a big domino to fall in both sides beginning to have a personal vendetta against the other, whether they wanted to admit it or not. It's natural human psychology not to want to give accolades or props to someone who you feel mistreats you, and that mental justification applies to both sides of the battle here. What made it very complicated is that Williams was a very atypical kind of jerk for his time. This is a guy who spit at booing fans from his own team, yet was decades ahead of his time in advocating for black players to stand alongside him in the Hall of Fame. He was called arrogant and ungrateful as early as 1940, but was one of the biggest supporters of giving his time and money to people battling cancer for much of his adult life. He had so much attention to detail placed in his craft. One of the biggest students of hitting who has ever lived. Something he'd carry on with him through mentoring younger hitters in the generations after him. But in his mind, writers were more after the bad they can find in his sometimes prickly personality. He used the word venomous to describe their tactics against him. Whether or not either side was in the right doesn't matter. We know that basically from the day he rose to stardom, baseball writers didn't like Ted Williams as a person. And you want to guess who votes on dishing out awards that shape the legacies of those players? The very same writers. Let's go through Ted Williams' run of getting absolutely robbed of MVP awards. 1941, Ted Williams leads all of baseball in batting average, home runs, walks, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, wins above replacement, and runs scored. Remember, this is the year he had over 400. He still loses handedly in MVP voting to Joe DiMaggio, a consummate media darling who wound up marrying Marilyn Monroe and got his MLB record 56-game hitting streak to top Williams being the last 400 hitter. DiMaggio was a Yankee, Williams was a Red Sox. That's basically it. Even though Williams has him beat in basically everything, and thus should have been rewarded as the better player, because he clearly was. 1942, Ted Williams leads the league in over 20 offensive categories, now that we have much more analytically advanced ones to look back on than they did. But even for the standards they had, my god was he the top of the class. Nobody is really in his universe this year. He loses AL MVP voting to Joe Gordon of the New York Yankees. Here's one of my favorite baseball facts ever. Joe Gordon won the AL MVP, leading the league in 2 categories: strikeouts and double plays hit into. Is this your MVP? Seriously. Ted Williams clears him in essentially every category that exists. But the baseball writers were so unwilling to give him an inch. Ted Williams won the Triple Crown on a team that won 93 games. Joe Gordon was a good player on the most consistently amazing team in baseball history. In their minds, Joe Gordon was a guy they could rest on without having to give a cocky hotshot kid who was rude to them his flowers. Let me say this, Joe Gordon is one of the best defensive second basemen of all time who hit over 250 career home runs. He's a Hall of Famer, and justifiably so, but he's no Ted Williams, are you kidding? 1943 through 45, Williams was at World War II. Say the Germans don't invade Poland, or Pearl Harbor doesn't get bombed, and old Ted is still crushing baseballs instead of flying military planes. You should have absolutely seen enough to convince you that he would still have been playing at this level for those 3 years. He very well could have earned his first MVP in that span. Possibly 2 or 3 if we're being real with ourselves. If international politics didn't ask for his service to be elsewhere, he really could have just continued to set incredible standards for baseball. We'll never know if he actually would have gotten the awards he deserved for them, but when he came back, he was back with a vengeance. In 1946, they had no choice but to give him his first MVP award. no one was really even close. The writers were forced to do their job and had no one remotely in his galaxy they could pretend was as good. Especially in the year he finally helped lead the Red Sox to the AL pennant past the Yankees in the standings. And before you ask, no, he didn't win the World Series. He wasn't all that great in it, and the Red Sox wouldn't win a World Series until 2004. 1947. It almost cannot be overstated how much better Williams is than Joe DiMaggio by this point, which feels like poison rolling off my tongue as an Italian-American to say that, because Italian-Americans are conditioned to view Joe DiMaggio like backyard baseball players view Pablo Sanchez. But as the Red Sox slipped down in the standings, the Yankees climbed back to the World Series. That is quite possibly the only justification possible in 1940s writer headspace to think DiMaggio was better than Williams, because the other 24 guys he played with did a better job. If you were doing a group project in school and the group you were assigned by the teacher averaged like a 1.4 GPA and you still turned in a good project, but a kid who was the teacher's favorite because they had been in their class for years and lucked into a group where all the kids are about to study physics at Ivy League schools did a little better on the project, who was really more valuable to the group doing well? I would say it's you, right? Ted Williams is you in this analogy. Should you be punished for having a crappier team? We wouldn't really begin to address that logic in MVP voting for about another 40 years. It was a big deal that in 1987 a guy on a last place team won MVP. But for 1947, the writers decided DiMaggio was the better player. 1948. The first year where you can actually kinda justify not giving Williams the award if you look at it through today's lens. Lou Boudreau of Cleveland had an amazing season. Probably the best in the American League on paper. But I'm gonna do something that is nuts by today's standards. Put myself into 1948 thinking. We're gonna talk about boomer stats, because that's what the writers had access to. So, I'm gonna conveniently restrict myself to that too. Ted Williams beats Lou Boudreau in batting average, home runs, RBI, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, walks, and even stolen bases. All these things are numbers they knew existed in 1948. He's behind in WAR, but in their minds, the only war they knew about was over. This is LA Noire era America here. We're on the high of everyone wearing fancy hats and smoking cigarettes in restaurants to celebrate being back-to-back World War champions. Whether the stats at the time knew it or not, Williams was racking up plenty of war, both in a Red Sox and US military uniform. The only thing they knew about that Boudreau beat Ted Williams in were hits and team wins. Cleveland won the World Series. Boston didn't. End of story. That makes Boudreau better, said the writers of 1948. He even got 11 times the first place votes as Joe DiMaggio, which shows you how important they viewed that to be. When, if you dumb it down to the stats that they had, it should have been no contest. Except the only stat that mattered was the one 24 other players helped influence for each of these dudes. 1949 was Ted Williams' second MVP win though, and the Sox didn't go to the World Series, let alone win it. They're in the middle of an 86-year drought after all. But again, he was just so good that they finally decided to ignore the team win column being the one and only decider. Listen to this, by the way. There were rumblings that the Red Sox could trade Ted Williams to the Yankees for Joe DiMaggio, which is absurd because Williams had like 12 great years left and DiMaggio retired after playing just 3 more. Shows you how insanely high everyone valued 34-year-old Joe DiMaggio with 3 years left in his career over Ted Williams with nearly 300 MLB home runs left to hit, with another war in Korea taking him out of the box for roughly 2 more seasons. The Yankees might have actually pulled off a fleece job on the Babe Ruth level. They almost stole the Red Sox blind twice. But thankfully, the Red Sox came to their senses. No trade. Williams stays a Red Sox for the rest of his career, which honestly might have been the reason he never won an MVP award again. Like I said earlier, he never really fell off. He finished second to Mickey Mantle as late as 1957 when he was 38 years old, but he never won one again. He finished with 2, should have had at least 5. You know who won 4 MVPs in a row once? Barry Bonds, one of the new answers that pops up a lot for GOAT of baseball. But what negates the Bonds GOAT case to plenty of fans is his connection to banned performance-enhancing drugs. No such rumors swirl around Ted. If the media liked him at all, he could have had more MVPs in a row than peak Barry Bonds. Williams honestly should have had 5 in a row, looking at his numbers compared to the guys that beat him, and that doesn't count the 3 years at his absolute apex he lost to World War II. And 1952, which he only got to play 6 games in, and the AL MVP that year was a 5'6", 139-pound pitcher. Bobby Shantz rocks. He's just like me for real, and he's still alive today at the time of writing this at 98 years old. He's still a guy Ted Williams totally could have smoked in MVP award voting, considering the league leader in home runs was just 32 that year, and the batting champion hit 327. Both of those totals are numbers Ted Williams could have obliterated in his sleep if he played the full season. So he won 2, got robbed of at least 3, maybe up to 4 more because of bad writer takes, and lost out on another 4 years where he could have very likely been the best player in the league. Add that up, and his ceiling was 10 MVPs. 10. If you win 10 MVPs, I'm sorry, you're going down as the GOAT and nothing would have stopped you. And it's like, not that unreasonable of a hypothetical, all things considered. In the game of playing hypotheticals with yourself, this one isn't that nuts. 6 in a row would have even done it without the wartime interference to his baseball career. If you were to even give him the Lou Boudreau one that modern advanced analytics kind of think they got right. And that's without the wartime interference. History puts you on an entirely different pedestal if you are awarded the trophy of best player for 6 straight seasons that you played. Say the writers still give that 1948 MVP to Boudreau with modern analytics on his side, and they're not all in a row. That's still 5 years where Williams should have completely mopped the floor with the rest of his AL competition without the wartime interference. I'll set the minimum number for MVPs he deserved without a shred of a doubt at 5 MVPs in 6 seasons. That alone would probably have been enough to earn GOAT status. But as you know, what prevented that for Williams was his relationship with the writers. I firmly believe that they wouldn't have gone strictly by the Red Sox not being the AL juggernaut if they just liked Ted Williams. He rubbed them the wrong way because he knew he was the best player possibly ever and carried himself in the worst version of that. But when Babe Ruth reportedly tells you to your face that he thinks you're incredibly good and he hopes you're the one to break his home run record, that totally gets to your head. If they so much as tolerated him, he goes down as the GOAT. He'd have too many individual accolades for that narrative not to sprout and stick. And I know he had no World Series rings, but baseball is the sport where you get punished for that the least. Willie Mays is the common GOAT pick for people of the generation after his, and he only won a World Series once. Ken Griffey Jr. and Barry Bonds are common picks for people's GOAT today. Neither of them won one. Mike Trout is considered easily the best player of his generation, and he hasn't even won a playoff game, let alone a World Series. Williams would have been able to go down as the consensus slam dunk GOAT with his individual accomplishments alone, if the writers felt like giving them to him, but they didn't. A comparison I can give you for Ted Williams comes in another sport. One you probably never expected me to bring into this video. Bowling. This is Pete Weber. Pete Weber is one of the greatest bowlers of all time, and he knows it. He is not shy about it. He had a line about his career once that goes down just as hard as the one everyone's seen that I just showed you.
Hate me or love me, you watched. That's all you could do.
Ted Williams was kinda like that, but not as cool about it. Williams didn't even give his fans any gratitude, let alone the writers who shaped public perception of athletes. To the people who cared about him, Williams was all ego and no charm. Words like ungrateful and arrogant defined how he was viewed for his entire career. And it's not wrong to say that. This was a guy who consistently was in trouble for treating the fans and the media like garbage. This is like not up for debate.
By any chance, did you ever accidentally
fart in the catcher's face?
Who the hell are you? For John's sake, that kind of damn question. See you later.
All the love came from his on-field performance, where he really did have a path to go down as the unquestioned best. But he lacked that fun, villainous charm that would have compensated for it. He wasn't a guy you loved to hate, you just kinda either knew about his tendency of being rude and stuck up, or didn't know enough about his personality to have an opinion. If he had any charm to it that kind of softened the blow, things change here. Professional wrestling had a guy who was mistreated by fans, and then he snapped at them, and it became a big villainous thing of his arc. It turned into a situation where he became really loved. You want to know how loved he became? Ted Williams wasn't able to achieve that kind of image for himself. I won't say Ted Williams is blameless here, because he absolutely isn't. There's certainly a lesson here about treating others the way you want to be treated and all that. I do think he had the capability of mending his relationship with the media. He just chose not to. I think that was wrong of him. He hated them as much as they hated him. The media had a chance to ignore that, like they would protect the truth of Mickey Mantle's image from the public for his entire career. They could have just decided to give accolades that determine player legacies to the best players. They just didn't feel like giving that to a person they didn't like, which still goes on today. I can't blame them too heavily for that if the writers are still wielding character into that today, as they probably should in some situations, but they did respect how talented he was. On the field, he was as good a candidate as we've ever seen for the player who most destroyed the competition they faced. They took the hardware and the individual legacy from him, but they weren't going to deny that level of talent if he didn't give them a reason to. And the very same writers who wouldn't give him an inch on individual accolades were the ones to vote for him in the Hall of Fame as soon as possible. It took Joe DiMaggio 4 tries to get into the Hall of Fame. It took Ted Williams 1. And he would surprise the baseball world by using his Hall of Fame speech as a platform to advocate for the inclusion of Negro League players who never got the chance to play in the major leagues to get inducted to.
And I hope that someday the names of Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson in some way can be added as a symbol of the great Negro players that are not here only because they were not given a chance.
A sentiment that's often credited to him as being the Kickstarter for. 5 years after he vouched for that to happen, Negro League icons Satchel Paige and Josh Gibson were given their rightful, deserved place in the Hall. And known selfish, arrogant, narcissistic jerk Ted Williams, perceived as a guy who thought himself so far above any player in the world, is the man who helped shift the sport's perspective on the unjust exclusion of these players to make it happen. 50 years after his last MVP award, the 1999 MLB All-Star Game was held at Ted Williams' home park in Boston. They honored the greatest players of the century as we as a society were about to move into the year 2000. There are some beloved guys getting honored here today, but one player would get the moment all to himself. The one every All-Star wanted to see. The one drove in separately after everyone else to be introduced as the greatest hitter who ever lived. Ted Williams.
The greatest hitter that ever lived. Number 9, Hall of Famer, baseball legend, Ted